Put these down. I don't have time to show you. Now let's throw the next one on. And the next one will be a 2-foot. Now there's a 24-inch cutting. And you can see what the root system looks like. See, most of your rootings are down here. Now the only difference between a 24-incher and that 16-incher I told you about is just the length of it. So it's bound to be just a little lighter. You put the next one on. There you are. Now it all depends how thick a rooting you start with as your basal cutting. I mean, how thick your basal cutting is. You can see these are monsters. So that they give you a beautiful rooting compared to your field run when you're starting with some cuttings that were taken farther up on that cane, so you don't have these inner nodes as close together right down here in the base. Here's where you get your real heavy formation of your rootings on these closer inner nodes. And the last one. Now there's your field run, see? There's nothing wrong with them. They're all good, but some are just heavier than others. Yeah.
Eventually these will catch up to the other vines.
Pardon?
This would eventually catch up to the other.
Oh yeah. In other words, at the end of 2 years, I doubt if you can tell the difference between, say, this rooting against that one against one of those big mallet things. They all take off as well. The only difference is you got a bigger one to start with, but before you plant it, you're going to cut it back to size anyway. So that's the only difference. But you cut them all back to size, and the worst thing to do is to plant these with a water gun where you just make a little tiny hole about yay big and you take all your roots off. That's a crime, because you have all that good potential there to give you a nice big husky root in 1 year, and the more you cut back, the weaker it's going to be to get started.
How would you cut those back?
Just with pruning shears. I'll show you in a minute. Show you in a minute. Okay, let's throw the lights on. Now that's enough for that. Just turn the lights on. That was just something extra that one of the students was confused about. Well, what do you mean by bigger rootings, and how come you had a 24-inch rooting in there that I gave you in the lecture? I'm horsing around down at this field station here to see which ones work out the best, so I just tried some. All right, the first thing we're going to start on this afternoon is you're going to get the knife treatment. Now, ordinarily, you should have had the knife treatment a week ago, but we had too long a lab, and this isn't going to be much shorter. But we have knives and we have knives. And the cheapest knives are these goodies right here, like you have in front of you. This is an excellent knife here if you're not going to do too much work. It's terrific. It has good steel in it, and it holds a good edge, as you found out already in the last couple of weeks. And they're sharp. If you do this way, don't do this way. Now, if you want a little better knife, here is one of your best knives for the same price. We're talking between $1 and $2. You go down to Davis Shoe Shop and say, don't tell him now because he uses these knives, and this is where I got them, down to Davis Shoe Shop. And I bought enough where I got them for $1.40 a piece. But they're excellent steel, but they're far better than this knife because they have a nice big handle. This is what I like about it. And your hands don't get tired when you've been doing a lot of pulling with this knife. Here's a couple knives right here. Take a look at them. Now, here's two knives. These are German knives. Are they any difference the way you look at them there? Are they the same knives? They're a little different. These are like left-handed monkey wrenches now, because we have left-handed knives and we have right-handed knives. Now the kind I just showed you, take a look at the blade like this. They're sharpened on both sides. This knife here, one of them will be sharpened on one side, the other one is going to be sharpened on the other side. So it all depends whether you're right-handed or left-handed as to whether it's a right-handed or left-handed knife. This one here is a left-handed knife. This is the one I would use. When you're ordinarily doing a lot of cutting, you don't do the way I showed you. You do the way a grafter does. He cuts toward himself. And he never cuts himself. So that, in other words, the first time you do for demonstration purposes. But you have left-handed knives and you have right-handed knives. And these are much easier to use than the knife where you sharpen on both sides. You have beautiful control on these knives. In other words, when you start pulling, it just goes right in. And what's behind it? It's the same as a block plane, it's the same as a wood chisel. But on this thing here, you've sharpened only on one side. This is flat. The minute you raise that thing at a little angle, boy, it starts in going right in like that. There's no problem. With this knife here now, you see you've sharpened it on both sides. Before this will get to the point where it's going to start digging in, you've got to put it up at a much higher angle before it'll start digging in. So in other words, in order to start your knife cutting, you've got to raise this knife at a considerable more angle to get it to cut than this one right here. You just bend it a little and in it goes. And if a person's used the two for an afternoon, you'll soon see the difference, because this gets cut much nicer. It gives you much better control. But they're all about the same price. Now, if you're going to do a lot of knife work, you might want to get real fancy and get the folding bladed knives, like we have right here. Because when you get through with these, you can put them in your pocket, walk off with them. Or if you're in Italy, you might end up with a big bruiser like this. Now this one here is not so good when you have it in your pocket, because if you sit down, you might rise up pretty fast. This doesn't go out of sight. This is what we call a quill. And when you're doing a certain type of budding, where you're putting your bud under the bark and the bark won't slip, you put this under the bark and talk to it to open the bark. So in other words, you will find some knives that will have that little quill type mechanism to it. Otherwise, most of your knives are on this order here for grape grafting. In other words, they're blunt on that side. Just the opposite from a tree knife for budding. Now, how do you sharpen a knife? Well, first of all, you got pretty good steel there. When you first get your knife, you can use, say, the medium-sized grade to your stone. And whenever you start sharpen a knife, you go against the grain or against the point. So in other words, if I have this knife here and here's the curved side, I'm going to draw it against the point. This is the way you want to do it, until you start feeling the origin. Some people will use a circular motion on this manner, but in other words, they're going against the grain until they feel a pretty good edge on there. And then you turn it over to the fine side and you do the same thing. In other words, but you're always going against the grain. It's the same thing when you're sharpening a chisel. Say you have a grindstone, it's going like that, and you have a rest right here. What do you do when you sharpen a chisel? Well, here's the flat side, here's the curved side. You put that curved side up against the stone and you go back and forth very slowly. You can see the sparks come out. And if you push on that too hard, before you know it, it turns blue and black on you. You burn it, burn the metal. So you want to do it very slow. If you're working on a knife, the nicest thing here is one of these old-fashioned sawhorse type sandstones, where you sit there and you make your feet go around like this, or rock up and down, and the old wheel goes real slow, and sometimes it bounces up and down a little. But it goes slow enough that it doesn't burn your steel. And if you want to get real fancy, you'll put a tin can up here with a hole in it so it'll drip water on there, and then you know you won't burn your steel. But you can get a beautiful edge on that. Well, after you get your edge, if you want something even finer than that, you go to something like a piece of marble. This is called an Arkansas black. And again, you go ahead and on the sharpening side, you either go against the grain like this. Now, most of these are oil stones, or you can make a circular motion. But you continually go against the blade, like you're cutting right into it. This is the way you sharpen it. Now, if you were to look at this blade, as you started with this rough stone here, when you got through, you'd see along the edge, you'd see like a bunch of file marks. That's exactly what the stone does when it's a coarse one. And the finer the stone you go to, the finer these little cuts come in here. So finally, when you get down to a real fine stone, you're starting to get rid of most of those cuts like that. And you can hardly see anything when you come to this Arkansas black. In other words, and the finer it gets, the sharper it gets. After you've done this, then the final payoff is sometimes you have a little like a bird edge or a little bent edge on the flat side from this continually going this way. So what you do is leave this flat and just merely take off that edge like that. And then you're done. Now if you want to shave with it, you go one step further. You get a leather strop. And instead of going against the grain with a leather strop, you go with the grain. Otherwise you won't have a leather strop anymore. So in other words, you go with the grain on a leather strop, but against the grain or against the edge on a stone. That's the final. Now how do you tell when the knife is sharp? Well, we can tell just by our finger here. In other words, going across with your finger, if it's sharp, you can feel that sort of a pulling. Some people will take a piece of paper, and if they can go down through the paper without it tearing, you got a sharp knife. I've been showing to the students the way I tell is when I can shave with it, it's ready to go. Now I didn't have time to sharpen my knife. Here's my knife here, but if I can shave with this, see, then it's sharp enough. So this is what we keep telling you students. Take it easy with these knives. Let's not go whittling, or let's not go slipping. Because the minute you slip, that Wednesday class really gave me ulcers last week. The folding handle knives are fine because once you get them sharp, you want to use them for one purpose only, for budding or grafting. And then when you're not using it for that purpose and you want to put it back in your box, then you can fold the blade like this and it isn't going to get dull on you. If you got a straight handle knife, make a little scabbard for it. And the easiest one is, once you have a knife like that, take an index card, bend it in half, put some tape around it, at least you got a protection for it. Or if you're going to be out in the field and you got an old piece of hose, rubber hose, you got one of these knives like this, it fits just right with this old 3/4 hose. You just cut a hunk out of it and it fits in there. You can tie it on your belt and that takes care of it. But after you sharpen the knife, make some sort of protection for it. Okay, that's enough for knives. Now let's go back to budding. Field budding . You plant a rooting. In other words, you made cuttings last week, you learned how to make a cutting, and you just budded it. Okay, so you planted that out in the vineyard. I don't care if you put in your stake or not. You can put in your stake. And you left hopefully 4 to 6 inches above ground level here. And you had a little shoot right here. This is the way it started out in the spring. And you planted this thing. If you had a hole here, let's say you had a 10-inch hole that you built, so you left your rooting out here, you left your roots 5 inches long to fill up that hole, and you planted it correctly, which you'll find out how to do probably next quarter. But this thing had until September to grow, and you got from these 2 buds here, you got a whole series of, let's say, about 5 or 6 nice big hefty shoots with green leaves on them. That's exactly what you got. And then you come along in August and September and you bud. Well, a budding crew consists of either 2 or 3 people. You have the budder himself and you've got his 2 shovelers. If he's a real ambitious, fast budder, you'll have 1 shoveler goes ahead of him and digs a little depression right around this vine. And there's 1 shoveler that comes behind him and mounds up as soon as he gets through. The budder will take and pull this whole vine over on the ground here, puts his pillow on top of that, and puts his knees on there. Now this thing is therefore bent over in this manner here. And all this stuff here is on the ground, and of course you got your pillow on it right there. Then he comes along and he puts a 45-degree angle in here, 1 cut, and then he starts up here and comes right until this cut meets, and he takes out that little chip, and then he goes to his bud stick and the catch is now to look at this size of that stalk and look at this bud stick here and decide which bud is it? The one down here or the one up here is the one that's going to fit when he cuts that bud off. So he goes to his bud stick over here. And you got a bud here and a bud here. This is tapering down as you go towards the top. But he comes along here. Here's your bud scar right in here. He starts at his bud scar and he comes in at a 45-degree angle. Or he can make it a little more acute if he wants. And then he goes right above his bud here about 3/4 of an inch. And he comes down at that same angle until he crosses in here and that bud falls out. Then he brings that bud over there and he puts it in here and it fits perfect. It says here in fine print. Now he has to hold that bud in place. Okay, so you take a budding rubber, you start at the top and you go wrapping it around like this, come down, wrap it across here, catch it underneath, and you got your vine budded. There's one more step. He takes about, let's say, 10 to 20% of this top growth here. He grabs it in his hand. He takes his other knife, not his good budding knife. He grabs it like this and removes about 10 to 20% of that top growth. And the idea there is to cause an overgrowth. He'll now have more root system than he has shoot growth to compensate for it. So supposedly, this is supposed to cause this to callus in faster by taking off some of your shoot growth. But after he finishes that, he gets off of it, the thing straightens up again just like that. You've got your budded vine here, it's been wrapped up. Now your shoveler behind him comes back and he mounds this whole thing over, just like this, with a nice mound of loose soil. That saves having to put wax or anything on it. Nice moist soil, that'll stay moist there and callus in at that season. Now, there's 3 prerequisites. For successful budding. Now, this is called chip budding. This is called field budding. Or you can call it another type of a graft is called a yema. All the same animal. But these are all the same. Chip budding, because it's a little chip of wood you take out. You do it in the field. It's field budding. And if you want to get fancy about it, you can call it a yema graft. Now, what are the 3 prerequisites? Well, the first thing you want is you want your rootstock actively growing. Well, that's a stupid thing to say. Anybody would know that much. Yeah, but here's what happens. I said you don't bud this till August or September. For years, over in the coast counties before they had irrigation, and that's only been within the last 4 or 5 years, those vineyards go dry over there. So if you planted your rootstock with the idea of budding, and you wait until the end of September, by that time their tongues are hanging out, and those little vines, because there's not much moisture in there, they've gone dry. So if you're going to be held up late, whether you don't have water available, you better dig a little basin around the vine and give it about 10 or 15 gallons of water about a week to 2 weeks before you're going to bud. You want to make sure that this rootstock is actively growing. Because if it stops growing, you might as well not waste your time budding. It won't callus in. So that's one prerequisite. You want this rootstock growing. The second one is you want mature budwood. Well, fine. Up until we had irrigation, you could go up in the Napa Valley, you could go over to Healdsburg. On all those hills, those vines would go dry early, they stop growing, and the wood starts maturing. So by the time that the fruit was harvested, the wood was mature. There was no problem at all getting mature budwood. But then we started the clean stock program. Where'd they plant those vines? Where they had irrigation first. Beautiful vineyards. And when you have irrigation and nice deep soil, the vines don't go dry. so the vines don't mature. So you have a heck of a time getting mature budwood. And when you do get mature budwood, it doesn't come in the end of August, like up there on top of one of those hillsides in the coast. So if you're lucky, you might get it by the end of September. Or sometimes you wait until the middle of October before you get your mature budwood. But your budwood has to be mature. Now when I say mature budwood, you have your shoot out here, it's green to start with, and then sometimes when it stops growing, it starts turning light brown in color. And where it's mature, it's light brown, and where it's immature, there's almost a definite line of demarcation. There's a little difference in color, but it'll be green here, and it'll be mature in here, light brown. You can see it. Now it starts in here, and it slowly works its way out to the end. So if you start, say, at the end of September, you might find 2 nodes like that. That's mature budwood, the rest is green as grass. Well, if you cut this thing off here at the base for budwood, you're losing a lot of good potential photosynthesizing area right there by getting rid of all those good leaves. So the moral is, you want to leave this go as long as possible to mature out here. Because if you have some clusters back here, you want to get some sugar in there. So you're fighting 2 things. You want to get this mature, yet you want to get these clusters ripe. Because quite often you try to bud, and the coast kind of growers like to bud before harvest. They want to get that over with. It doesn't always work out that way. So you hate to take off green wood out here and destroy all those good leaves, because you want to let this fruit ripen. So you're in between the devil and the deep blue sea. Here you want to bud, you want to get budwood, but if you take it too early, then you're delaying the maturity of your crop by taking too many leaves off those vines and delaying your crop. But you've got to use mature budwood. You can't use green budwood. So you've got this to fight. So you might have to wait until, let's say, October 10th before you get mature budwood. Well, you decided, well, I can start budding October the 10th, so somewhere around October the 1st now, you give this a drink of water. So everything is ready to go. So you get your mature budwood and you bud your rootstock. But what happens? Well, by that time, especially if you're around Healdsburg in that area, around the end of October, you catch a rain and everything cools off. And it doesn't callus in, it's just too cold. So what you need, one thing after this, you need, let's say, 6 weeks of warm weather. After budding. And that's to enable that bud to callus in there, so you're ready for the winter. So in other words, you fight this. You want to keep that rootstock going. But you got to get it mature budwood and get it early enough so that when you do get it budded, you got about at least 4 to 6 weeks of good weather after you bud, so it'll callus in. Because if it doesn't callus in, again, you're down the drain.
Would it be to your advantage to wax those buds in if you're not going to get that 6 weeks?
No, I don't think it'll make a bit of difference. Now there's another sneaky way to get around this. And what they're doing is they collect wood at this time of the year in the winter, and you put it in refrigeration. So you can have budwood any time of the year you want. And especially growers where they do not have irrigation, around Healdsburg and those areas where they ordinarily get their budwood late, they put this away in the wintertime right now, and then they come in June and July. Boy, at that time, everything is moist around there and things are growing great guns. And these are real happy. They're really going good. And you bud then. You can bud in June, July. Well, it's a good time, too, because all your main heavy chores are done. You've got your pruning out of the way. You've got all your weeding done. Everything is cleaned up. In fact, you're getting ready to go on vacation before the harvest. So it's a nice time to get it done then. Yeah.
Are you budding on the first year rootstock then?
Yeah. Well, no, it's a little older than first year.
So you have to plant it in the June before. Or the-
Yeah, yeah. In other words, you can hold it off that long. There's only one catch if you bud at this time of the year. This thing here has a good long season to grow, and that rootstock is going to get not twice the size, but it's going to increase in size. So if you don't go in there and check this, probably at the end of September, this thing will expand so that rubber budding strip will not stretch, and it'll girdle the vine. So the first time we tried it, we did not uncover this mound in September. We came through there in December. By that time, this thing had grown so much, it had grown clear around the rubber budding strip. It really made a mess. So if you're in an area where this stock will grow considerably, and I'm meaning some place where you have irrigation, nice soil, particularly lodi, where those stalks really get big, you've got to uncover this and cut that budding strip. But this does work. Now, the longer you hold your budwood in cold storage like this, gradually the effectiveness of those buds, the fertility decreases. So June you'd get a good take, July you get a pretty good take, August it's not quite as good, September it's much poorer, and October it's murder. So in other words, you want to start using this budwood fairly early. Now ordinarily, if you do not cut the tops off of your rootstock here, this bud will not push. But if you were to remove, about 3 years ago, one of the growers budded his vines in lodi, and he called up, he says, "Hey, my bud's growing, what do I do? What happened?" I said, "How much of the top of your vine did you take off?" He said, "Oh, about half of it." I said, "There's your trouble." In other words, he had his vines growing in a real good loamy soil there with plenty of water. After he budded here, and he probably budded in September, he cut half of this off, and he caused a terrific surge of this root system into this bud. And the next thing he knows is that bud is out there pushing on him, and this is in October. Now, he only had one problem. When you push like that, you don't mature this nice shoot before frost comes along. So then you're in trouble. This is what the big trouble is. I said you better pray that you can slow this down in order to get that shoot mature. Or if it doesn't mature, the only other alternative you have is to come through and throw a mound of soil over this to protect some of these lower buds here so they won't freeze back. But this is murder. We do not like to see this happen, and this will happen if you're budding, say late in the season, you get carried away and you take too much of this leaf surface off. We specify one other thing. If you're budding in the fall, for at least 4 weeks after you bud, don't water it. Don't water it. Because where you have free water around your bud union, it will not callus. So do not irrigate. Now some people have gotten by and given a budded area a light sprinkling, and they haven't had any trouble, which means they didn't throw enough water on there to have free water around the union. But if you say irrigate in a furrow where you have surplus water coming up and wetting this whole thing here, then you're coming by in the spring and calling us up and say, "How come my buds don't grow?" So do not water. There's one way a person might try to get around it. I was down at Fresno this July, and I had my budwood I kept in refrigeration. I had a bunch of rootstocks there to bud. I was putting Emperor on these. And I wanted to bud in July, just like I told you, with stored wood. Fine. And I said, "When are you going to irrigate?" He says, "Tomorrow." I said, "Fine, that's a big help." So I knew that if I budded these today and he irrigates tomorrow, I might as well kiss him goodbye. So I tried an experiment. Now, I'm not recommending this. This is not the recommended procedure. But I put the bud in here, and instead of wrapping a budding rubber around it, I took this white tape, and I wrapped the tape completely around the bud and everything, so it was tight and watertight. And I didn't even cover it up, just left it there. And he irrigated, like he said he was. But the water didn't get into it. And under the tape, it calloused in. There was no problem. So in October, I took off one or two of these tapes to look at these buds. The buds had calloused in perfect. They were growing with the stalk because the stalk was expanding. They had turned green, the same color as the stalk. I had used mature wood, and it went from this color into a green color and grew right along with it very well. We need more work done on this to see how successful it will work. So I'm telling you now, this is not the accepted practice to wrap with tape. At present now, the book tells you, and I'm telling you, you ordinarily put a budding rubber around this, and then you cover this over with soil, and you don't irrigate. So until we have more information on this other method, this is the way the book will tell you. Let's stick to that method.
How high above the ground level do you want to insert that bud?
I'd like to see you put it at least, say, 4 to 6 inches above ground level, provided your rootstock was planted that high. Yeah.
What is warm weather for 6 weeks?
Warm weather? I can't give you any temperature, but you know what happens after you've had a nice rain, how things cool off? Well, if it warms up after a rain, you're all right. But if it continues to stay cool and then never warms up again, this is what I say is bad. So in other words, you want to have normal temperature without this undue cooling that occurs after rain and then remains cool. Okay, so this is chip budding. Now we're going to do this afternoon. We won't have too much time, but we come over here and get one of your vices here to work on, and then we have some rootings to work with. I worked hard for you students. I went clear down to Fresno to get these for you. This is what a rooting looks like. Not as good as the ones I showed you in the picture, but this is a rooting. And ordinarily, when you have rootings, in fact, somebody even worked on it already, all these come off. In other words, you cut all these back before you're going to plant. This is standard practice. These are not as good as the ones I showed you in the picture. There should be 3 or 4 of them at the base here, and you leave the length of these main basal roots to fit the diameter of the hole you're going to build. Now, to hold this here, I can't use this, so I'm going to actually take this off. But ordinarily, you just cut that back to fit the diameter of the hole that you're going to dig. And up on top here, you'll choose the best shoot that comes out and cut that back to about 2 cuttings, 2 buds like that, 2 to 3 buds. This is what you plant in the ground to about this level here. Now, this is what I'm going to work on. All right? Now, ordinarily, you want to put the bud on the side where the stake is, because, in other words, a budder will pull the vines away from the stake, and he puts his knees on them here. So we'll assume this is the stake side here. Now you can see that your rooting is not perfectly round. It's a little oval shape. So if you have real wide buds, you can work on the wide side. If you don't have wide buds, you can work a little on this side that's not as wide. But what you come down here and do first is you make this 45-degree angle cut into your stalk. Now don't go halfway into it. Just go in about 1/3 of the way. And then we start about 3/4 up above there, and we taper into that. There you are. And you notice I'm cutting away from you. I'm not cutting towards myself. When you bud, you cut away. So there's no problem. I don't want to see any casualties today. So now you've got a chip like this. Now the catch is you got your bud stick, and one of these buds here depending on the width, when I cut it, it's going to fit that perfect. Now, I don't know which one it's going to be, but I'm going to guess it'll probably be this one right in here. So now, don't do it upside down. You look for your bud scar, and right below your bud scar, or right through your bud scar, you make this 45-degree angle cut. And you can rock your knife away from you. You can see what I'm doing. I'm going to rock my knife away from you, just like that. And then we start about 3/4 of the way up here, and we come in, and I'm going to rock my knife back and forth, cutting through there gradually, until I get through there to where I made my cut. Now I'm just about through, and there's the bud. See what it looks like? There it is, right there. Now the catch is to hope this is going to fit in there. Did it fit? There it is. See? No, the bud overhangs this side here about twice the thickness of a piece of paper, and to me that's not good enough. I want it perfect. It should fit a little on the inside if I can. So that's easy. When the bud is too large and you haven't gone clear halfway through your stalk, all you got to do is shave off a little piece of this, and that'll make it wide, and then the bud will fit. So I'll just cut down a little deeper here. Now we'll see if that'll fit. Okay. Now we're right perfect. So now all we have to do is get one of our budding rubbers here. We start on top. We catch the budding rubber. Now you got to remember, you got your foot on this, so what you have to do is essentially, you're just working your way down. I'm still above the bud, and I'm going to go down below it and catch it. And then when you're finished, you make a loop on one side, you stick the end under it, and you've got it. And there's your bud. That's all you have to do now. And then the budder comes and takes about 10 to 20% of the top growth off like that, and he goes down to the next vine, and he's done. That is chip budding. Okay. Now we've got, that's for a small vine. Now you can chip bud. If you miss this the first year, say the bud doesn't grow the first year. Well, let's find out what happens first. Let's do a little better job here. We put this bud in, we wrapped it up, we cut this back a little. Okay, and we got it mounted over. And we go away from it. We come back next spring. The first thing we do in the spring, about this time of the year, is it's been raining all winter on this thing, and this mound is solid. It's really solid dirt, like a hard brick, except that it's wet, but it's packed. So the first thing you have to do is remove this mound. The bud isn't growing. So what you do is give this a crew cut. I mean, cut everything back here off the top. Cut it back just to a nubbin. Cut all those back there. And then recover this. You don't cut the budding rubber. Recover this inch or two with nice light soil, and that will tend to make this warm up quicker. Get away from this hard packed soil. With loose soil, it'll warm up quicker, and we'll get a whole bunch of new shoots coming out from the top here. A lot of new, several green shoots, and hopefully this bud will start pushing. Now you'll come back maybe in 2 weeks, and you'll have some green growth here, and you want to hope this bud is getting out a ways. If it's out to an inch, you're ready to go. In other words, once you got that bud out at least an inch, and then you feel it's going to stick on there. If it's just barely swelling, leave it covered up and come back a week, 10 days later. But if we've got it out of an inch, then we have to cut the top off. And we cut the top off at an angle. And that angle is away from our bud, because this vine's going to bleed. And all that sap, we want it running down the back side of your rootstock, so it won't drip over your bud and possibly get some bacteria or whatnot, infection in here and knock out your shoot. So we cut off the top, and this will be, let's say, from 3/4 to 1 inch above that bud at an angle. And then your top is gone. You also cut the budding. Well, they say you cut the budding rubber then. So you cut that off. Because by the time you've gotten over 1 inch of growth here, you've got some pretty good activity and some callus and cambium union down here where this cut surface is. Then we take a paper collar. We make a cylinder out of this paper collar. The paper collar can be ordinary roofing paper, about 9 inches square, or they'll sometimes take some, I don't know what they call it, but they get them from printing shops. They're heavy cardboard. They're about that wide and that high. They'll make a collar around your rootstock, leave some space in here for your shoot, and then they mound around that to keep it in place, and your shoot comes right up through that collar, and the minute it gets up here, you put your first tie on it, and then bring it up the stake.
How do you apply that paper collar again?
Pardon?
How do you work the paper collar?
The collar is, you just make a cylinder out of it. Form it into a cylinder, and you put it around this bud here. You can push it against this side here if you want, but you leave some space in other words, here it is right here. You leave some space in there, and then you keep that in place with a mound of soil. And Mr. Shoot comes right up through the mound there. And you've got him going. Now, that's the easy way. Now, every once in a while, you get some of these rootstocks that won't cooperate. So in other words, in this case here, we didn't cut this off. But let's say the bud did not grow. Well, the bud did not grow. As long as you've got your top on here, you can leave the top grow, and if you want, you can come back the next fall and bud it. Or you can come back in June or July and bud it. That's one possibility. Or if you want, you can cleft graft it. That's another possibility. If you cleft graft it, you cut the top off and you split that there, and you put your sign in here. Right in there. So that's a second possibility. All depends how long you want to wait. You bud it the first year, and by the end of the second year, it might be, 1 inch in diameter. You can still bud it the second year if you want to wait that long. Otherwise, if you don't want to wait that long, you can cleft graft it. Now, how do we cleft graft? Well, here's the way we cleft graft. It's very simple. Now I'm going to show the bark real thick, which it isn't. But on a vine, it's just like a tree, you have bark, and this is wood. If you want to get fancy, it's a xylem. And the bark is the phloem. And you've got the pith in the center. And right between the bark and the wood is the cambium. That's the business end. This is what I want. So what we do is we take a splitting tool. And you've all got one. Here it is right here. If it's a little tiny rootstock about that big, you can split it with one of these knives here. It's very simple. Like this one here, you can split that very easy. But you split it just like that, and you put a sign. You put 2 signs in it if it's big enough. In other words, your sign comes up like this and fits on that side. And you put a sign on this side. I can't draw it very well here. Let me show you what it's going to look like in cross-section now. All right, we're going to split that right in here. We've got it split, now we've got it opened up. There. Now that's opened up. Okay, now we're going to put a sign in here. And the sign that we cut is going to look like this. If you want a two-bud scion, the top bud's going to be in the inside. The bottom bud's going to be right here. You make a nice long straight cuts. We don't do like this. We don't make a cut like this. And we don't make a cut like this. In other words, not one of these scallop type. We want a straight cut. Exactly like that. That's on the outside. On the inside, it's not going to be quite so wide. So in other words, what I'm going to show you here in the dots, that's on the inside. So in other words, it tapers like a boat. And if we were to look at that on the side now, if this was a side view, well, I didn't do a very good job. Here's your bud here, and here's your bud over here. This is the one you can't see. But this is smaller than this side, and I'm going to show you exactly what I mean here. Let me find my right knife here. Here it is. Okay. Say I want to use this bud right here for my bottom bud. Okay, now I'm going to make a cut. Start right up here. Get rid of this tendril right here. Okay, now I'm going to start right beside my bud here, and I'm going to come in at an angle like that. And then I'm going to turn it around the back, and I'm going to come in at the same angle. But I'm not parallel now. I'm coming in at a little boat-tailed. Now there's your cut. Perfectly straight, but wider. This is the outside, but it's wider out here than it is in here. See the difference? See the difference in width? And the way you can tell that also. See the way this comes down at a real point? If these two sides are of equal width, this will be straight across here. But whichever side is the wider, that's the one that's going to have the longer point on it. So this is the way I can tell if the inside is smaller than the outside by this point like this. All right? Now, this is going to go in to this cleft I've made. There's only one catch. The only place where I can cross cambiums is right on the outside here. In other words, there's only one place for a cambium, which is right in here, so it's going to either have to touch on the outside here or touch on the inside. Well, I want it to touch on the outside, that's why I've made the outside wider than on the inside. So what this is going to look like in cross-section is right here. There. Here's my bark. There's my cambium area. Here's my cambium area, and here's these two sides that I've cut. And they're not parallel. They taper in a little. So actually, if your bark is very thick, your scion here will be a little inside the bark, as you can see there from the width. Now, I want to be sure that when I put this in, that someplace my cambium is going to cross. So therefore, now I can't be sure by looking at it here, but in order to make sure, instead of putting this in perfectly parallel with our stock here, if we were to put it in like that, we put it in at a slight angle, and we angle it so that the top bud is out, and the bottom of your point here, your scion, is in. I'll show you what I mean. These are all these details Dr. Cook was telling you about. A few principles, but hundreds of details. Now say that this is our stock here that we've split, and our cambium is right in here. Now when I put that scion in, I'm going to put it in at a slight angle, like this. Now this is exaggerated. I'll show you what I mean. Here's our bud right here at the very top. Someplace, see the bark is this thick, someplace in here, the cambium of the scion is going to cross the cambium of the stock, right in here. This is the reason I put that in at an angle, and generally it's such a way that up on the top here, the sign is beyond the cambium of the stalk, and down in here it's too far on the inside. So this is what I mean. I want it out on the top and in at the bottom. This is a split graft. Now a split graft can be done on your small stalks here. It can be done on any size stalk where you want to work at ground level. So in other words, if we had a big vine like this that got broken off by cultivator blight up in here, then you come down here just above ground level. It could be a very big stalk like this. You'd split it and you'd put in your two, in other words, your sign on one side, your sign on the other side. But at ground level, you have to also mound over to keep this thing dry. Keep it moist so it will not dry out. Now, of course, you've got this split in here, so you wonder, well, should I wax that over? It's not a practice to wax. In other words, we split that, we put in our scions, we mound this over, and let this come up through our soil. But this is where you have a large stalk, or you can have a small stalk. It makes no difference. But you have to work at ground level if you're going to use a cleft graft. Yeah.
If you cut off rootstock down to ground level, taking off all the active rootstock buds, are you going to kill the rootstock if the cleft graft fails?
If you do not get a cleft graft to take and there's no buds, you are a dead duck. Yes. Yes. Once, even if you have a rooting like this, and you've budded, once you cut that top off, if that bud fails and you don't have something to come in there with a growing point on it, you are a dead duck. It will die. So the safest thing to do is when you are budding, put some wood away in the wintertime now for some of these buds that do not take. You can either go in and rebud them, and you can save yourself a year, or you can split graft this thing. Or if you want to do something real fancy, you know, I showed you whip grafting. Well, you make a long whip, one that's about an inch and a half long here, and you put the two together and you tie them. That's a real fancy type of a grafting for a small stock, is a whip graft. In other words, you can use this thing, say you've got a Cabernet vineyard out here on its own roots, and it's very common all through our new areas. You got Cabernet planted, somebody stuck in a Carrigan on you, and you don't like it. You can graft it over. You can graft it over, and if you got domestic root, in other words, the variety itself, you can graft below ground level. You don't have to necessarily graft above ground level. You graft above ground level if you've got a rootstock. This is rootstock. But you can graft below ground level if you've got the variety on its own roots. Now, what's wrong with that? Most people use this system to graft with. There's only one thing wrong with split grafting. And let me take this off and put some ammunition. Oops. Right back. You've got a 2 or 3 year old Carrigan vine here, but it's in a Cabernet vineyard. Okay. The trouble is, when you go down at low level here, you're getting into one of these nodes here, and you can't split through a node. If you do, why, it doesn't split straight, it splits crooked, and you can't get that sign in there. So in other words, you got to split someplace where you have nice, smooth inner node area. As long as you can find that, you're okay, there's no trouble. Now also down low, there's a tendency of some vines, they twist as they grow. So in other words, even though it looks straight, when you put your knife in there to split it, it twists at an angle on you. It actually curves. So then you have another hard time getting that sign to fit very well. But it's the most common type of grafting that people use is a split grafting. But it can only be done at low level. And the common practice is to cover this over with a mound of soil. All right? Let's go through with it then, because you'll have the answer. You just hang on to that a minute. I better put this. Okay, now you hold. I want you to split graft today. I want you to work in pairs because one of you are going to hold this while the other does the splitting. You're not going to hurt yourself. Hang on to that right there. Oh, no, down here. Okay, so in other words, you're going to take your, when you go to split, make sure that there's no nodes around there where one of these branches come out. You split on the opposite side. So all you do is just go right down through the pit. There's no problem. It goes very easy. Take it out. Now you got to cut that sign. If I can find that sign I had. Well, I'll cut another one. Okay. Now I'm going to start right next to my bud there. That's going to be in the bottom. I'm going to make that one long cut there. One long cut there. Now, my inner node length here is rather long, so instead of using a 2-bud sign, I'm going to use a 1-bud sign. And you've got a screwdriver here. You put that in there, and you can spread your stock, and you put that in place just like this. I'm going to be out at the top and in at the base, and there it is right there. Now, I'm way in. I've exaggerated. Actually, it shouldn't be in that far. But this trunk is strong enough to hold it. Now, ordinarily on a trunk that size, I would use 2 scions. You'll have a lot of fun cutting these. The other class has, but when you cut these things now, I want you to cut away from yourself. In other words, if you want to, you can hold your sign like that, and you can cut like this. But whatever you do, unless you're familiar with those knives, don't go cutting like I'm doing, because I don't want any more catastrophe. See, there's a good sign right there. There's nothing wrong with it. And it has too long a snout on it, though. Okay, there it is right there. Now, in case you're using a smaller stock than this that hasn't got much pressure to hold that in place, then you have to wrap string around there to give it some pulling strength. But all you do is, if this is a root stock, it'll be above ground level, you mound over it. If it's a fruiting variety on its own roots like Kerrigan and you're changing it over, I don't care what level you do it, but do it where you can make a nice clean split. Don't try to cut through here and put a sign in there. But that's your split grafting. Very simple. And it's the most common form of grafting.
Do you want to do any waxing?
No waxing. Now, so we've got split grafting now. And you do this in the spring. Chip budding, you ordinarily do it in the fall. But if the fall doesn't work, a little of it's done in the spring, although there's not too much known about it. We can't say much about it. We don't have that good a technique worked out where you can successively chip bud in the spring. You can chip bud in June and July, though, but ordinarily it will not grow until the following year when you force it out. Okay, now, what if we have a 2-wire trellis here, and say you've got an established vine. Again here, say you've got Kerrigan, say you've got Palomino, and you don't like the variety and you want to change it over to something else. It's a crime to have to destroy this nice big stock here by coming down here at ground level and cleft grafting. That's a crime because you've got that established. There should be some way that you can keep that. Well, there is. There's a way you can do it. You can use a wedge. Well, first I'm going to say saw curve, because that's in the book, or it's a notch graft. But I'm going to modify that and give you a wedge graft. Now, if you want to know what a wedge graft is, Probably the best book there is on propagation that tell you all types of propagation that you can also use on trees is this one by Hartman and Kester, Circular 471. Go upstairs to the second floor and either go to the Viticulture Extension Service office or go down to Pomology Extension Service office. They have them. And this is something, everything's in it. And you've got to read it. This is something because there's plenty of printing. But if you're a little, have aversion towards reading and you want to look at some pretty pictures instead, this book here, put out by Walter Krauss, but it's put out by Stribling's Nurseries. I'm not advertising any nursery, but this is a beautiful pictorial review, and the photography is excellent. And if you can't tell how to do it by looking at those pictures, then you need glasses, because it's very easy to see and very well described. Unfortunately, it doesn't have every type of grafting in it. But the wedge graft is very well described, as well as a bark graft and budding and a few other of the simpler types. So both of these are good to look at. So at high level now, we can kerf, notch, or wedge. And what that essentially amounts to is it involves first taking a saw and you make a 45-degree angle. In other words, cutting across 45-degree angle in this manner. In other words, about like this. This is the cut you make, and then you take your knife, or you take a half-round knife, and you come out with not quite a 45-degree angle to that like that. In other words, you end up with this kind of a little slot. Now I'm going to draw a real big slot. It looks like a piece of pie in there. And then the catch is here, you've got to cut a sign to fit that piece of pie. And this is what most students, as well as myself, we can't do. And in fact, unless you're an experienced grafter, it's almost an impossibility to do. But it looks something on this order here. I said it's going to look something on this order. This has some oddball angles. There it is right there. Now this sort of a wedge-shaped thing then fits into that slot, and if the slot hasn't got too much of an angle to it, like a 45, you can tap it in place and it'll stick. But if it has pretty much of a 45-degree angle, then all you can do is put that in place and put in a couple of brads and nail it to hold it in place. And this is very difficult to make. It takes a lot of skill to come up with that to fit your slot. Now, about 3 or 4 years ago, when I was working with Dr. Cook on this class, we got a student in here that was a pomology major. His dad had an orchard. He said, well, we got a faster way of doing it than this. I says, fine, show me. I'm anxious to learn. Anytime we can do it easier. And he says, okay, we do it like this. We make what they call a wedge graft, and it's in this book here. In other words, he found it in the book before I did. It shows he was reading it. But you have your stalk there. You put your knife in here at an angle, and you make a cut, just like that. And that goes straight in here. Goes in about, let's say, a ½ an inch. And then you come across here, and you do the same thing. And if you overlap, that doesn't hurt. You go in here a ½ an inch.